Well, hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. And welcome back to part 2 of my analysis of the Jordan Peterson phenomena through the lens of integral theory. In part 1, I explained a little bit about integral theory, and that it is the theory that human consciousness and cultures are evolving through discernible stages of development, and that there are 3 stages online currently in our developed world: traditionalism, modernity, and postmodernity. Each of these have their amazing gifts. Each were radical moves forward when they arose. Each arises in conflict with the previous and with the rejection of the previous. And as a result, each has its downside, not the least of which are its fanatics. So I also make the case that there's a new stage of human culture and consciousness that is arising, which we call the integral stage. It's the postmodern stage. It's the stage arising out of postmodernity. And it wants to befriend each of the previous stages and appreciate the piece of the truth that each has, and bring that to a larger system, a larger mind and heart that can contain opposites, that can hold paradox, that can, for instance, fully embrace science and fully embrace spirit, rationality, myth, yin, yang. And I explained that. I've explained that in many of my podcasts, and the integral movement is about that. And but I just want to give everybody a simple grounding. So I focused in part 1 also on the thesis that Jordan Peterson has many qualities of an integral thinker. He's, for one thing, he can straddle all 3 of these stages of development. That's sort of a beginning of an integration, that he can be in each of them. He is, adequately postmodern in the sense that he sees a legitimate role for the political left. He's for equal opportunities for women and minorities and so forth. That's how he defines it. But these are postmodern realizations. That he also has a foot in modernity, in the sense that he is a college professor and he deals rationally and all of that sort of thing. But as I pointed out in part 1, what makes Peterson especially interesting is that he has a center of gravity, and you might just call it his heart, that is at home at the traditional level. And his book, which is a big bestseller, 600,000 copies, probably more by now, is called 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. And as I said, you couldn't cram more traditionalism in 8 words if you tried, because, traditionalism is about rules and roles and men being men and women being women. And his rules themselves start with stand up straight with your shoulders back. And it's all about the basically downloading of the civilizing qualities of traditionalism on the chaotic qualities of pre-traditionalism, which is what we call the warrior stage of development. So it's about delaying gratification, being a good person, being honest, faithful. And he also has this idea of growth, and this growth to goodness and away from evil. And all of that is this, antidote to chaos. And also, as I pointed out, it's a great service. He's doing great integral work in the sense that he is become a spokesman for a group of people, and these are people who, for one reason or the other, have not gotten the traditionalist download, actually. A lot of young people, particularly young men, that, he provides a good, true and beautiful installation of the traditional stage. And, sometimes these young people didn't have good role models. Sometimes they had postmodern parents who took, they were kind of uncomfortable with traditionalism themselves, the idea of patriotism and ethnocentric and, religious, so these people don't have it. And so he's doing good work in that way. So I do think, and I ended, I think, part one with this thesis, that he makes a significant mistake in his view, in his philosophy, that creates a lot of consternation and conflict that I think Integral can help sort out. And the mistake is that while we see postmodernity as being a stage of evolution that arises out of modernity, he sees postmodernity as being a mistake and being a wrong turn and a totalitarian ideology that he traces back to fascism and Maoism and earlier. And that is, a problem. So, there's an upside to this in the sense that he is at war with postmodernity and political correctness and all of the stuff that he's become famous for. And that, like I said, it actually provides an intellectual foundation for people who need that. And from an Integral perspective, we're not necessarily against culture wars because we realize that conflict is one of the ways that we fight our way forward. But he is, to many of us, it's a philosophy that is boring because we're kind of over the fight and we see a way of integrating and there's a way of moving forward. And so that's what I want to talk about is, some of the particular problems that are caused by this idea that postmodernity is fundamentally a wrong turn. And I'm going to start here by playing an interview that Peterson had quite recently, I think, February 13th, with Jonathan Rowan, who is an integral thinker, clearly, and you'll see in this tape. And he gets at Jordan Peterson just on this issue of, can't we see postmodernity as a continued development of a self-authoring person? And Peterson says no, that it's a ideology, not a stage of development. And when he talks about stages of development here, he talks about equilibrated states, and this is a Piaget term for what happens as children grow and they have these equilibrated states where they have a stability. And so that's just a little definition there. So let's go to this.
Got it. So if somebody's in one of those states, and that state just happens to be one of strong emphasis on inclusion, strong emphasis on dealing with past injustices, and strong emphasis on sort of, equalizing society in certain ways, they feel that that's what they're called upon to respond to. They feel as though that is their self-authorship, is to speak to that.
I don't believe it can be.
Okay, why not?
Because none of those are their ideas.
But what if
they're ideological ideas?
Well, is it not possible for someone to take upon themselves a critical relationship to that so that it becomes their own?
Yes.
Right.
It's definitely possible to do that, but it very rarely happens.
But it can happen, and that can be a good thing.
It's always a good thing when you take a set of abstract moral principles and unite them with your own experience. There's a deep Christian idea that you're supposed to imitate Christ, right? That's the deepest of Christian ideas. Jung wrote a lot about that. It's like, that doesn't mean you travel to the Middle East and dress in white robes and carry a cross. Like, that happened 2,000 years ago. What it means is that you bring the doctrine to life in your own life, right? Really in the specific particularities of your own life. And so the first thing I would say is that if you try to do that with an ideology, it immediately ceases to be an ideology, because you actually can't do that. Your life will burst the bounds of the ideology. But I would say that to the degree that you start to make the ideology truly personal, that you also start to transform it in ways that are beneficial. The problem with ideology is it's a universal set of solutions. And you think, well, that's great. It's like, well, yeah, except it eradicates the particularities, and that's not great at all.
So, I mean, ideology is tyrannical when we're sort of unconsciously subject to it and it's shaping our actions and our lives. But there's also a kind of ideology that's our own critical relationship to a set of ideas and how we embody them and experience them in our lives.
I wouldn't necessarily see, one of the things that I've strived to do is to distinguish between a genuine religious system and an ideology. An ideology is a parasite on a religious system. So a religious system has to have a variety of elements, and I detail them out a lot in Maps of Meaning. I won't go through them. But it's the thing about a religious view of the world is that the positives and negatives are both included. So the individual is a hero, but also an adversary. Culture is a tyrant, but also a wise king. Nature is a beautiful, wondrous, revolutionary, transformative force, and also cancer and Anopheles mosquitoes and the plague. And ideologies don't play that game. They pick and choose their narrative characters.
No, I understand, but surely it's possible then along those same lines for someone to say, look, white privileged men are fine and often wonderful people doing great work, but they have too much power, and there are other people who don't have access to those worlds and those opportunities because of that.
As soon as they
bias.
use the terminology white privilege, I'm out of the discussion.
Right. Well, is that not going too far? That sounds ideological to me. I mean, that sounds like something that you're subject to, that you can't see beyond or relate to.
No, I don't think so.
It feels to me like
you're
captive to that critique in such a way that you can't see any possible good in it.
No, I understand the motivations that are driving the use of that terminology, I think, better than the person who's using the terms.
But in your experience, in a particular context,
yeah.
But this issue is happening around the world in multiple contexts,
yeah.
where people who feel marginalized, who feel they have, feel they've lost out in certain ways, who might try and tidy the room, might try and sort themselves out, but still find they can't get a job, can't get enough money, can't get access to a life they want.
I'm not clear at all that that's the case in the West. No, I don't believe that. I mean, we know perfectly well, for example, that the best predictors of success in the West are intelligence and conscientiousness.
Right.
All right, there's a lot there to unpack, and I'm going to do that in the rest of this podcast, but just a couple things quickly. When he talks about when you try to make a religion out of an ideology, it immediately ceases to be an ideology, and your life will burst the bounds of the ideology. And that's true, but what we would say from an integral perspective is that every stage has an ideology, first of all. Every stage has what he's calling a universal set of solutions that eradicate the particularities. Traditionalism, for instance, Christianity, it's indeed saturated in terms of meaning. And it is also delivers a universal solution, accept Jesus, and asks for obedience and conformity. And at some point, human evolution bursts out of that. And we burst out of all stages because we get the download that they are there to deliver to us. At modernity, the idea is that everybody becomes rational, that human rights, not obedience, but that my own volition matters. That becomes the new ideology, the new, in a sense, religion. Postmodernity has a universal set too. Postmodernity, it's funny, and we need to respect postmodernity for this. After the first half of the 20th century, with all of its totalitarian world wars, bombs, the whole bit, the next stage of development was a stage of development that became sensitive. That's not an ideology. That's an unfolding of human history in the breast of people for whom it happened. And it's a sensitivity that wants to rehabilitate, to rescue, to bring back online the people who have been left behind by the previous stages, the losers in modernity, the people who can't compete. They don't have a lot of merit for the meritocracy. The people in traditionalism who are the sinners, the heretics. The people in the earlier stages who were basically the impoverished, the prey, the serfs. All these people who, that's what postmodernity's ideology is, but it's also more than that. They're all more than that. So we can look at it in terms of one of the big bugaboos that Jordan Peterson talks about, and a lot of people who are his fans do, and they're right, actually, but it's the idea of political correctness and controlled speech and thought. And that's really what got him on the national stage or the international stage about a year and a half ago, when he refused to go along with a new code in the Civil Rights Code in Canada. He's a professor at Toronto University, that he would not use gender-neutral pronouns because it was a law and that was forced speech. And so that's really been the pivot for his, his movement of the intellectual world, which has really happened. But what we can see is that there's a political correctness at every stage of development. At traditional, you don't want to blaspheme God. It can be bad for you if you do. And that's even today in theocracies, where you could be whipped for saying the wrong thing. So the idea that political correctness is just a postmodern phenomena, there's always been a thought police, that's always been a speech police, and it was far more and is far more brutal in traditionalism than it is in postmodernity. Also in traditionalism, there's just naturally what we would call racist. They would say, clannish. They trade on patronage. They're tribal. They preference their people over the others. And that is an ever increasing circle as we evolve, of the people that are inside our circle as part of us, the same as us, and the people who are outside who are not as worthy of moral consideration. And, so that's traditionalism, and it's just naturally that way. It's racist in that way that, most of human history has been. So modernity also has a political correctness and a thought police, in a sense. Think about it. If you're at a meeting at work and somebody starts arguing for a plan of action because God revealed it to them in a vision, well, let's just say that would be politically incorrect, And yet that kind of argument, that God revealed it to me, this is what we should do, people, that would be absolutely acceptable at the earlier stages, both traditionalism and earlier. In fact, it would probably win the day, depending on how beautifully you transmitted it, if God's voice came out of a burning bush or something. But in the modern world, you're just going to creep everybody out, So, there's a thought and speech police there, and it has been well enforced. And in the postmodern world, they have one too. And in this case, the poster boy is the guy who worked at Google, who violated the new postmodern speech code by saying things about women and men, that they have differences and preferences and personalities that are hardwired and so forth, and presented evidence and whatever. You can take it or leave it. But it offended the sensibility of his coworkers, because the center of gravity there, at least in the human resources department and so forth, is postmodern. And so he was fired. And I don't like that. From an integral perspective, we're hip to all of it. And we want to recognize it everywhere it shows up. But we also don't want to see it as some, malevolent recapitulation of the gulag that is trying to drag us back into some dark pit of evil. It's just the thought police, that's all. And actually at postmodern, it is, relative to the earlier stages, pretty benign. Which is not to say that it is benign and that it ought not be fought. And this is where I support Peterson. There is a new dominator hierarchy that takes place at postmodernity. And, I get it from my own experience. I was at the Masters of Divinity program at Naropa University here in Boulder, which is a small private university, Buddhist-based, founded by the Tibetan Rinpoche, Chogyam Trungpa. And very postmodern, also a lot of integral sensibilities at Naropa. But when I was there, it was particularly postmodern. And the dominator hierarchy had been inversed, so that the more victim status you could have, you're a woman, you're a poor, of color. I was gay, thank God, because otherwise I was a middle-aged white guy who was there as a dilettante, and I still had to pay. But it can be brutal. It really can. And there were times when I was just shut down, and you learned what you could say and what you couldn't. But over time, our little cadre, there were like 14 of us, we sorted it out, at least to the point where we certainly loved each other at the end. Did we convince each other? No, but we had beaten our swords into plowshares for the most part. But it's clearly a problem, and I think one that has gotten far worse in academia particularly. Andrew Sullivan published an article, I think it's in New York Magazine recently, where he talked about take it seriously. Take the postmodern or the progressive thought police seriously, because it's escaping the academia and has entered the human resources department. Peterson talks about this too, sort of the whole human resource profession in companies and corporations, and to be aware of it, and that there's bad shit that's the part of it. So fair enough. And we do want to notice that. And we are, against dominator hierarchies. Now, I would also say, and this is from a integral point of view, we want to see the piece of the truth that the postmodern progressives bring to the party that weren't there before. And I think of my classmates at Naropa in the MDiv department, and these were what you would call, in fact, we called ourselves proudly this at the time, social justice warriors. That's become a sort of a epithet lately. But they were that in the best sense of the word. As I said, I was there, as a lark, but these people were there to work their asses off for the disadvantaged and the animals and the environment and the whole postmodern agenda for very little money. And that was what they were dedicating their life to. And what is it that they see? They don't opt out of the white privilege conversation. And I do think that Rowan was right to challenge Peterson that, boy, that you opt out of any conversation about that is seems ideological. And it does, because, clearly white privilege has existed in our culture. And here's where Peterson is right, and a lot of people who argue this are right. It has been made illegal in the exteriors. That is, you are not allowed to discriminate according to race or religion or female, male, and that sort of thing. That's all illegal. That is enormous progress. But what the postmodernists also realize is that there's an internal racism that's, more unconscious, that and sexism, where if you have, think about it yourself, do a little thought experiment. If you get a resume from a young John Smith versus Juan Smith versus Jamal Smith, there's research to say that John Smith gets, I don't know how many times more responses than Juan, who gets more responses than Jamal. That's all part of what is being pointed out here. And sort of the unconscious norms where in workplaces where men unconsciously dominate and women unconsciously submit, there's nothing wrong with pointing that out. In looking at that. That doesn't mean that Western civilization has to be dismantled. It means that we can move forward, and we have been. And I think the Me Too movement is an enormous move forward in a wringing out of a sexism that wasn't unconscious at all, it was conscious. And all of a sudden it becomes outrageous. It was accepted, and Harvey Weinstein was joked about at the Oscars for years. Everybody knew. And then all of a sudden it's outrageous. Now you can see there's moral preening and there's all kinds of crap, all of that comes along with it. But we can all feel it in our own, the shift. This is raising consciousness, people. This is the realization that women get to have a sphere of safety, and even if they're wearing high heels, even if they're wearing lipstick, and Peterson has this famous interview with Vice where he talks about, these are sexual signals. We haven't sorted this out. He's right. But we are sorting it out. I mean, his thing is we don't know what the rules are. Now, it's very traditional. He wants the rules. Well, the rules are a moving, it's a moving target. So, these are all worth staking out. And I would also point out that just as the extremists at every level, the religious fanatics that go off in the monastery or whatever, we don't want them to be violent, but the people who are scientific materialists to the point where everything is reduced to stuff, to material, and to postmodernists who are, the extreme of the social justice warriors. They are staking out territory for all of humanity. You don't have to buy the whole thing to get the appropriate download, but they are increasing the playing field. And that's worthy, and it's also liberating in a way. I mean, it's like this consent movement, if you will, that is going on in campuses where, it's not just no means no, it's yes means yes, that you have to have an affirmative consent in order to have sex. And, when people first started talking about that, I thought, oh, please, But, the more I think about it, is it actually the worst thing in the world that a young man and a young woman would actually talk and connect over what they want to do sexually and be conscious about it, even in real time? And is that ultimately a wet blanket, or is that a liberation? And I would argue for the latter, and I would use something that Peterson talks about a lot, and it's this idea that, what's up with this 50 Shades of Gray and this whole bondage and discipline movement? And he thinks it's a shadow of the anti-masculinity that is part of postmodernity, and he may be right about that. There's probably some truth to that. But it is also the community, the people who do that stuff have super juicy sex, and it's just one of the central tenets of the whole thing is that you communicate and you say what your safe word is, and you say what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And when you put that out on the table and say, okay, baby, here I am, then that is a liberation to actually bring back online the masculine, feminine polarity, I could say, but also just the polarity of domination and submission, which is just part of the juice of being human. For most of human history, that's all we had was domination and submission. We have stages, we have levels that have been built on top of that civilize it and have rejected it and have sort of tried to put it in the shadows. But further development says, hey, wait a second, let's bring that out of the shadow. And let's play with that, and let's have a good time. And I think that's actually where we're headed. In the sacred world to come, as I say, we're going to be riding each other around like ponies. But we're going to be doing it deliberately, consciously, joyfully, and we're going to have all kinds of ways of being together that are conscious. So, I'm kind of good with how some of this is unfolding. So this whole idea of domination and submission and dominator hierarchies is a big part of Jordan Peterson's sort of thesis about life. And he, his first chapter of his book is about, by the way, here's his book, 12 Rules for Life. And he's starts out with the lobsters and how they dominate each other, and how just domination is, and dominator hierarchies are built into the system, and that they're still online. They are still online for sure, but there are stages beyond dominator hierarchies. For one thing, postmodernity comes in and seeks to eliminate all hierarchies. All these historic narratives of superiority of my religion, my people, all of that horse shit is, there is no truth. It's all just flatland. And that's actually progress. It doesn't feel like progress, especially if it's your dominator hierarchy that's being gored, but it does clear the system for the next stage of development, which is an understanding that Integral is trying to get its arms around, and that is this idea of natural hierarchy, or chief of which is evolution itself, development, that 9-year-olds are not defective 12-year-olds, and that then there's 18-year-olds, and that each of them is precious, 100%, and each of them has this different capacities and capabilities, including some that 9-year-olds have that 18-year-olds don't, like magic, things like that. So, we can sort this all out, but I want to play a piece from Peterson talking to Camille Paglia, I believe was her name, Paglia, who I often love. She's a sort of an iconoclastic. She considers herself transgender. She used to be a lesbian, and she's a great iconoclastic thinker. She's also, like Peterson, polarized against postmodernity.
Now, but here's the problem. This is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves, but here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason...
And actually, I do want to say that before this, they were talking about people who come to his talks, and there's one particular woman who is organizing resistance and counter demonstrations to his talks, and calls him a Nazi and so forth, and has swastikas and the whole bit. So that's what he's talking about.
The reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical, right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up in it's not even disbelief. It's that there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. If you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. So I don't know, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal. I really do believe that.
I too believe that this is symptomatic of the decline of Western culture, and it will just go down flat. I don't think people realize that masculinity still exists, okay, in the world as a code among jihadists, okay, and when you have passionate masculinity, okay, circling the borders like the Huns and the Vandals during the Roman Empire, that's what I see. I see this culture rotting from within, okay, and disemboweling itself, literally. Now,
all right. So once again, I think you see a astounding overstatement of, the being surrounded by the Huns and the Vandals and disemboweling ourselves and with the, fashion, all that stuff. It reminds me of where a lot of my liberal, bolder friends go with Trump, that he's Hitler, and we're going back to the Kristallnacht. But it's effective in stirring up the troops, I guess, and maybe there's something functional there, but again, just so boring in a way, and so it seems so unnecessarily, alarming. Or alarmist. And regarding this idea that we are in danger of regressing to the circumstances of the first half of the 20th century with these world wars and fascism and communism and all of that, I think integral theory can actually help us understand what's going on here and take a little heart in where we've come. It's true that these were in many ways modern countries that did this. They were technological, they were scientific. Germany, Japan, the United States, all of us were in a technological world. We were in the middle of the 20th century. But we still had traditional interiors. And that's the nature of evolution, is that, we see it as coming online. A simple way of seeing it is it comes online in first person in terms of our own consciousness. It comes online and unfolds in terms of second person, in terms of the culture and how we relate to each other and identify, and in third person, in terms of the technology and the systems that we create for ourselves, from horticulture to agriculture to industrial and so forth. And you can see as we walk up these stages of development that those change. But it's not always even. And so the first half of the 20th century can be seen as sort of the opposite of a sweet spot in history. It was a sour spot in history, where countries had become modern in terms of weaponry and logistics and concentration camps and nukes and all of that. But they hadn't become modern in the interiors. The humanist thing hadn't fully come online. There was still this idea of romantic nationalism and militant nationalism, and where my group, my nation is superior, and the uber man, and we need to dominate. And that's traditionalism and warrior, and previous to that, that's human history. Genocide is nothing new in human history. It was standard procedure for most of human history. But to do it with modern technology has a certain kind of extra horror to it that actually is what moved the culture forward, so that we have post-World War II, this period of long peace that is often commented on, this radical diminishment of violence in all areas of life in the modern world, where modernity and the sense of the rights of every individual, and even post-modernity, where this idea of one culture being better than the other is sort of dismantled, that this is progress. And so we end up with people who are modern in the interiors as well. And what you realize at modernity in the interiors is fighting doesn't get you where trading does. I mean, you move from, dominating to let's play together. And as I said, this is the way we fight our way forward, and we also, the other F word, our way forward. And so this is the modern sensibility that has, Germany and Japan being the most civilized nations on earth. They're great global citizens. And the idea that Germany would go attack France, I mean, it's just, it's off the table, and we can rely. That's reliable. That regression's not going to happen absent some, complete, asteroid hits or something, where all of a sudden we're back in the Stone Age. Now, when I say that these cultures have become modern in the interiors, I would say that roughly 2/3 of the populations of these countries have become modern in the interiors. There's still a traditional strata that all of us can feel in our own minds and bodies, even if we've transcended it, we do include it. But there are some people that's their center of gravity. And they, in America, they still don't get how we could still be at war 15 years later in Afghanistan when we could have bombed them back to the Stone Age. But fortunately, this is moral development. The majority of people don't feel that way. And that's a ratcheting up that is reliable. So I think we could take some faith in that, which is a traditional value. We have faith in the system, faith in God. We've grown up. And even his specific complaint here, where he talks about he's defenseless against these women, and that the recourse that he has with men, which is to punch them, is forbidden to him with women. And that I'm not sure he thinks that's necessarily a bad thing, but he feels that constraint. And, he has many options open to him with his detractors and with this woman. He could walk away. He could make his own sign that says, "No, lady, you're the Nazi." He could use his amazing verbal acuity and vast knowledge to win an argument with her. One of his fans, or make her look bad. One of his fans can videotape it and put it on the internet. There are countless such videos like that on the internet. And he says, "I don't know how you control crazy women." Well, if you get a restraining order if you have to, but you don't bemoan the fact that you can't punch them. And what you actually ought to do at some point, when you are over, the passion of the moment, go off and lick your wounds and consider whatever nugget of the truth this woman might have in her big basket of crazy, because there probably is one. And so where he's coming from is from, again, this traditionalist center of gravity where, the threat is always there of physical violence. It's what keeps the world civilized. And it's true. It does keep the pre-modern world civilized. Fear of, physical violence is what works there. But after modernity fully comes online, you don't do that anymore. That doesn't mean that you don't defend yourself against pre-modern people. If you are approached in a dark alley and mugged by somebody, you want to be able to turn into a lethal weapon. And so physicality is absolutely part of it. And we want even that red warrior thing online. But only in self-defense, only when we need it, only when we're dealing with pre-modern people in a violent situation that they started. And that's a pretty bright line that I think actually keeps the world civilized. And yet that's not, there's an honor, there's a feeling of, he talks about it a lot. He's ambivalent about gay marriage because he thinks, it messes with institutions that have been here forever. It's not a matter of rights for him. He talks about that he would never marry a woman who wouldn't take his last name. Yesterday, he tweeted to this critic who wrote a article, Pakja Mishra. He wrote Jordan Peterson and Fascist Mysticism in the New York Review of, I'm not sure where it is. I'll link to it. But Peterson tweeted, "Are you calling me a fascist, you sanctimonious prick? If you were in my room at the moment, I'd slap you happily." So, so meeting insult with violence, not good. And actually, the article that Pankaj Mishra wrote is one of the more thoughtful critiques of his book. I've read many that were just plain old snide and just didn't get it and didn't even try. This guy traces, the sort of fascist impulse through Jung and Joseph Campbell and a lot of Peterson's heroes. And, believe me, this guy needs a good dose of integral thinking too. But at least it was thoughtful. And anyway. All right. So, and I do want to say the other thing about fascism and Maoism and all of that stuff. Clearly, that did arise, and I think Jordan Peterson's thesis that when modernity comes in and science undermines the belief in God and religion is weakened, that means that you're weakening the culture's adherence to the ethics of that religion. And when you weaken those ethics, you leave a void, and it can be filled with this, craziness, or this sort of new secular religion of Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao Zedong and all of them, and that free speech is the antidote to that, and that's fair enough. But the problem with the way Peterson treats religion, and religion's a big part of his thing. And again, I'm going to make a distinction between, do I think that the way Peterson handles religion in his book is very fruitful for the people who it is meant for? Yes. He brings he's rooted in Christianity. He's done many lectures on the sort of archetypal and mythological and moral gifts of Christianity. He's ambivalent about, is Christianity literally true? And but that's good, because a lot of the people that he's dealing with, they can't quite go there either. But they do want the download of what Christianity brings, the upside of the download, if you will. And but if you think that Christianity or these great axial religions are the only religions, and everything that came since then have been ideologies, then you've put a ceiling on evolution. You're not seeing that these are actually all unfolding worldviews, and that modernity's wringing out of the magic and enchantment of life is as painful as it is, and as how unwilling people are to go with that, and they should be. It is a necessary stage. And then postmodernity starts bringing sort of irrational religion back on, and we'll do dances in the woods and sweat lodges and so forth. And Peterson actually does that, by the way. He is he's affiliated somehow with one of the indigenous Canadian tribes in his part of the world. And, he's done stuff with them and is very respectful and very respected. And so that's all good, but still there's that lid that he imposes, that ceiling that just stops the process of evolution. And it leads to things like this. And here's a quote. He says, "I think the Bible is true, but I don't know what that means. I don't know how to reconcile it with the idea, for example, that the universe is 13 billion years old, or that we evolved over this 4 billion year period from nothing, essentially. There is this overlay on top of this mythological landscape that is also true, but I don't know how both of these can be true at the same time." And let me say that from an integral perspective, I do. I know how they can both be true at the same time. They're both true in different domains. Is Christianity true? Yes. It's truer than true in the sense that it's capital T true, which means it's true without necessarily being accurate in its particularities. But it downloads codes and instructions for life. It tells us a story, as all great religions do, of a world that is bigger than this life and that is drenched in meaning. And by receiving that, we feel enlarged and enlightened and enlivened. And even better than that, we feel seen and loved. And that's really in my sense, the big problem with his way of dealing with Christianity is that, when you talk about the moral teachings of Christianity, all great, love the neighbor, all that good stuff. When you talk about the archetypes, of the virgin birth and the sacrifice and death and resurrection, these are great. The virgin birth is just an acknowledgement, it's in many cultures, of that we are born not just of the mother and father, but of the indwelling spirit that is, part of the fabric of the universe, that is the loving intelligence, the creative force of the universe. That's that. The sacrifice, death, and resurrection is an ongoing process of laying down our small self and sacrificing it so that we can get bigger. And, these are all beautiful. And but there's another stage where it is actually true too, where there is a loving creator God, for lack of a better word, who not only has all these lessons, all these wonderful archetypes and things that we want to imitate Christ, all that good stuff, but is also living and sees me and loves me and holds me precious, and that I can relate to and I can surrender to and I can sit in his or her its lap, and I can be lived instead of just living, and this world is not my home, and it's mysterious, and I can use the myths, and I can use all the teachings of all the religions, all the way back to the magical and all of that good stuff, as beautiful art forms, as transmissions, but I don't have to hold them as being true in the exteriors, which is the domain of science. So, for me to believe that Jesus walked on the water, I'd need a videotape. I'm very comfortable saying that probably didn't happen. Do I rule it out entirely? No. It's a mysterious world. But I think I feel comfortable going forward with the idea that, I could throw that bathwater out and still keep the living, precious, personal presence of a creator God. And at Integral, we can tease those things apart and hold them both fully at the same time, not in some blenderized, homogenized way, but we can hold them fully. And that's a good thing. So yeah, science does wring the magic out of life temporarily till we move beyond, that sort of hard materialist modernity. But paradoxically, it does actually deliver to us a very beautiful and potent new creation story that tells us that 13.8 billion years ago, something blew out of nothing and turned into stardust, which turned into dirt, and the earth happened, and then dirt got up and wrote poetry, and dirt got up and became you and me in this moment. And wow, that's the story of evolution, of this flourishing of creativity and complexity, and we would argue consciousness that was there at the beginning and just continues to complexify in ways that are jaw-dropping. And that there is a spiritual path in there somewhere. That there's a new religion to be had that that passes all the tests of science, except the science test that says material's the only thing that's real. And I'm with Jordan Peterson here, where I don't see any reason to believe that the only thing that's real is dead matter that has this sort of subjective delusion of being real at some level of complexity. But that living spirit is also a piece of it and is evolving with it. And it's material, it's mysterious, but it's also illuminating and enlivening and enlarging and very, very beautiful, very good, true, and beautiful. So yeah, so I think I'll end it there. Like I said, I do think that he is very evolutionarily potent. He is a very, very worthy spokesman and fighter for a worldview that needed to be brought back online in a healthier way. And I think that by not seeing that evolutionary force continues, that he gets sidetracked and goes down a lot of rabbit holes that are interesting for people who like rabbit holes. And there are a lot of people who do, and that's part of the process of, people who are downloading this. They need to fight. They need to get in the game. They need to get in the arena with the infidels. Fair enough, as long as it's nonviolent. And you don't smack people, Jordan. But beyond that, there's a way of holding it all that is, I think, far bigger and far more alive and comprehensive and all kinds of other good words, I'm sure. All right, so thank you so much, everybody, for listening. If you're interested in some of the stuff I've been talking about, I've done many, many, many podcasts on all of these topics in culture and religion and politics and Trump and all of it. You can find that at thedailyevolver.com. I'm also on Integral Life. I do live webcasts there. You can go to Integral Life and see the work of Ken Wilber. You can read his books. The Brief History of Everything's a good start. Steve McIntosh's Evolution's Purpose. There is a whole integral community of people who are working with this, what we see as the next stage of human unfolding into an ever-increasing dimensions of goodness, truth, and beauty, to which I say hallelujah, and check it out if you're interested. Okay, thanks again. See you next time on The Daily Evolver.